to this panel. Welcome to the Environmental Racism is Garbage Symposium. I have to say, every time I say that, I really like that name for the symposium. I think it's really, it really rings well and rings true. And I'm delighted to introduce Nancy Stevens, who is a dear friend and a very appropriate person to be moderating this panel. Nancy has had a lot of experience working in working on trauma issues in Indigenous communities, and her dissertation was using Indigenous methods to do so. So I'm going to let Nancy take over from here and moderate the panel on ecological grief. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Ani bojo sego. Mino wase mak majakwa kwe na dish na cause makwana dodem hudna shone meanwhile jaganashan dao. Guelphna dunjaba meanwhile North Bay Nipsing Migwa Doda. So I've had a journey of many years and places, and one of those places was Peterborough, where Mickey has been rooted for many years, and I got the chance when I was working at Nijkawendida on a Shnabek Kwewak Services Circle to do some work with Mickey when she was still teaching, and it was a real pleasure working with her and the other people at that school there. So I'm so pleased to be counted amongst her friends, and just really appreciate this opportunity to sort of dip into a slightly different stream than what I sort of normally am going along. I'm currently in North Bay working as an assistant prof, I think. I don't know what I do these days, but in Indigenous studies, and it's like Mickey said, I just finished my dissertation last year and am really looking at Anishinaabe traditional practices in healing from trauma. So that's a little bit about me. The way we've kind of settled on how we're going to go with this is I'm going to pass the proverbial mic or the virtual mic over to, we'll start with Marietta, but I'll get each of the artist presenters to introduce themselves, and we'll get rolling. So Marietta.
Right, thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's really an honor to be part of this event. My name is Marietta Radonska, and I am an assistant professor in environmental humanities at the Unit of Gender Studies at Linköping University in Sweden. That's why, it's already dark here, 11 p.m. So, as I said, I am based in southern Sweden. I am originally Polish, and my work, I'm by training a philosopher. My work really focuses on the questions related to death, dying, and mourning in the context of the environmental change and disruption. And I have worked a lot with questions around life and bioart, so very much at the sort of crossroads between philosophy and visual culture. I think that I will stop here.
Okay, I am then going to ask Ulysses if he would introduce himself.
Hi, well, I'm a geographer in the LSE. I am living in my home region of, home state of Guerrero in the Costa Chica region, which is the eastern coastal part neighboring Oaxaca. I research Afro-Indigenous geographies, and yeah, I'm really happy to be part of this panel. Thank you for organizing.
Okay, and then we have Jennifer. There you are.
Hello, hi. And my name is Jennifer Abbott, and I'm a filmmaker. My best known work is actually The Corporation that came out in 2003. We have a sequel called The New Corporation. And I also have another film that I just released. I mean, I have many films, but the new releases, and the one most pertinent to this panel is called The Magnitude of All Things, which is about ecological grief. I had the idea for that film about 10 years ago. So I have been thinking about, feeling, learning from others, traveling the world, talking to people on the climate front lines about ecological grief for quite some time. And yeah, that's who I am. And I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Settlers call it Vancouver, Canada.
Oh, thank you. And Tasha, would you like to introduce yourself there?
For sure. Ani Bojo. I just lit a bit of a smudge. So in our Plains Cree and Anishinaabe traditions, we usually smudge, particularly when we're talking about this type of topic, which can be quite heavy. So I'm just acknowledging that and inviting people to ground themselves in any way that they might see fit to do so. Ani Bojo Tanse, Gapemote Askisko, and addition cause at Neonakon and Donjaba Makwando, Dam Nij Medekwe, Nihiao Squel. I introduce myself in the language of the territory that I'm currently situated on, which is in Swakamuck, or Northern On Territory, Sudbury. I'm Bear Clan, and I'm also Medekwe, Plains Cree, and Bajan, and Scottish Métis, quite the mixture. I was culturally raised, however, with my Plains Cree and Scottish Métis family, and so I'm grounded in that cultural tradition. I am an assistant professor, or I was, another story, but I'm an assistant professor in Indigenous Studies, and I'm the Ron Ianni Fellow at the Indigenous Legal Orders Institute at the University of Windsor, where I work within the realm of Indigenous legal orders and what that looks like. More importantly, though, I am a Medekwe. I belong to the Medewin Society, a very old society that works with the medicines. And part of my obligation and responsibility as a Medekwe is as a water walker. And so I'm a grassroots activist. I move across the water, I move across the land in ceremony, following my late teacher and mentor's legacy, Josephine Baumann-Dahlman. So I've only walked about 8,000 kilometers for the water, but it's something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm really excited to be here as well. Kananaskumtun Chimiigwech, everyone.
Which I am. So as we're going through the presentations from each of the artists, if people have questions that they want to ask the artists, can you put them in the chat? And we, meaning Nikki and I, will be keeping an eye on the chat to to gather those questions and then to bring them to the to share them with the artists after they're sort of collectively done talking. So does that work for everybody? Are we good to go? Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, we will begin back at the beginning with Marietta, and
Absolutely.
I'm going to mute myself as well to reduce the bandwidth.
Thank you so much. So I will now try to share my screen, and I will be also actually reading my paper. I hope you can bear with me. So the title is Environmental Grief, Queering Perspectives, and I'm trying to actually bring different threads present in my work. So I will start with very kind of, probably too simple introduction in terms of the concept of environmental grief. I will then move to a kind of proposition of a kind of entrance point provided by the emerging field of queer death studies in which I have been very much invested and passionate about and invested in developing. And finally, I will kind of end with a case of environmental violence that I have been researching with my colleagues, several cases, but we are looking in our research at the Baltic Sea, so it's kind of our own backyard, which is also related to the questions of waste and other things. Right, so let me start then. Conceptually speaking, environmental grief is a form of grief experienced in relation to the present or anticipated ecological losses of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes resulting from severe anthropogenic environmental change. Experiences of environmental grief differ across geographical locations, cultures, communities, and even individuals within a given community. Existing scholarship on environmental grief is deeply indebted to indigenous knowledges, anti-colonial and decolonial perspectives, and queer feminist environmental humanities and post-humanities. While under-researched, environmental grief is seen by scholars as a form of disenfranchised grief that is not openly accepted or acknowledged in society. It may be experienced by individuals as well as groups or communities. Yet, environmental grief has a potential for generating action in an ethical, political, and activist sense. Focusing on environmental grief brings us then to some of the questions which I would just like to throw here as a kind of opening, maybe, having this thing in mind as well. So, what do expressions of environmental grief in a given location or context tell us about our relation to non-human others, ecosystems, and landscapes? And what do they tell us also about values we ascribe to the more than human? How do we understand the meaning of present and anticipated ecological loss? How do environmentally based grief and mourning contribute to the changing cultural understandings, meanings, and significance of death and loss in a given place and context? How do we cope with the knowledge that some species, environments, landscapes, and cultures will not survive the damaging effects of the climate change and environmental disruption? How do environmental grief and mourning interact and intersect with other forms of grief related to various forms of necropolitics, as well as issues such as race, class, geopolitical location, colonialism, and neocolonialism? For instance, like speaking of from this location of Sweden, there's also a question of the situation of the Sápmi in the Nordic context in general. And finally, how can environmental grief and mourning be translated into action? How can they become a catalyst of ethical and political change? How can these insights contribute to research and understanding in other fields, like, for instance, environmental humanities? And in a sense, I mean, we are operating from a context of ecological and social proximity to death. And this is also the context where the field of queer death studies enters. So one could also ask, what kind of articulations do we actually need in order to account for the complex problematics of death, dying, and mourning in the here and now, where some communities, groups, or individuals are deemed to be less grievable, or perhaps whose death is not even recognized as death in the first place. So queer death studies is an emerging field which takes research on death, dying, and mourning in new directions by drawing on queer, feminist, post-humanist, decolonial, anti-racist, and trans theorizing. Queer death studies differs from more conventional research on death or death studies by way of critically focusing on the framing of death and extinction in the contemporary world through Anthropocene, necropolitics, and necropowers of colonialism and neocolonialism, racial and extractivist capitalism. Death and mourning become here an ethico-political question grounded in global structures. Queer death studies pays attention to systematic necropolitical productions of death in conversations with critiques emerging from political movements for social, environmental, and planetary justice and change. It builds on critiques of the dichotomous divides specific to Western modernity and is characterized by a critical focus on normativities and exclusionary notions of the human, casting the death of those who differ from the normative human subject in terms of gender, racialization, class, geopolitical situatedness, able-bodiedness, sexuality, and species as less grievable or not counting at all, to get back again to the work of Judith Butler. So queering in queer death studies, or queer and queering as a verb, is understood here as in an open-ended sense as strange making, defamiliarizing, where the critical defamiliarization implied may lead to an opening of other, more affirmative horizons. As the field has been unfolding, the strange making is linked with three kind of critical moves, which are at the same time very much entangled with one another: queering, decolonizing, and post-humanizing. So decolonizing death involves critically dismantling the violent necropowers of colonization, racial and extractivist capitalism, which made death become, in Greg Lemon's words, life's quiet companion for racialized and indigenous people worldwide. Post-humanizing death refers to the systematic problematization of the planetary scale mechanisms of annihilation of the more than human world in their ontological, epistemological, and ethico-political dimensions. It takes seriously the issues of responsibility, accountability, and care for and in dying more than human worlds. And finally, the move of queering encompasses both, on the one hand, open-ended deconstructing of normativities and processes of normalization in various forms, and on the other hand, deconstructing and undoing of heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity, binary gender, and sexualities governed by reproductive biopolitics. So these entwined critical moves are crucial for approaching intersecting structures of global necropolitics emerging out of post-colonial violence, extractivist and neoliberal capitalisms, and the entangled systems of oppression, racism, sexism, speciesism, classism, queerphobia, ableism, to name a few. And from there, I would like to actually stop for a moment at a kind of local, in terms of my own situatedness, example, the question of the Baltic Sea and multiple axes of environmental violence that transformed this body of water into a space of unlivability for the local multi-species communities, which also remain in relation and affect local human communities. Already some years ago, the Baltic was pronounced the largest so-called dead zone in the world due to its hypoxic character. The levels of oxygen are simply too low to provide optimal living conditions for the local modern human inhabitants. The Baltic's geographical characteristics, that is its enclosed character, plays a role here. However, the main factor to be blamed is the disposal of sewage, wastewater, and dispersed nitrate agents into the sea, coming primarily from German and Polish industry, farming, and tourist sites. Furthermore, the Baltic is also exposed to large amounts of newcomers, non-indigenous species that are brought with ships and that alter already vulnerable biodiversity of the local ecosystems. And finally, after the Second World War between 1946 and 1960s, several 100,000 tons of chemical and conventional weapons were dumped and scattered in the waters. The density of military waste, including sunken, decommissioned ships filled with munitions, is particularly large outside Bornholm and southeast of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, in the Gulf of Finland, and in the Skagerrak Strait of the North Atlantic. For instance, outside Måseskär on the Swedish west coast, and outside Arendal in Norway. Tons of metallic canisters and containers have since been corroding for some time and leaking their toxic contents into the aquatic habitat, forging a sinister heritage of military waste at sea. And I have a little map here with some of the sites where it was dumped and a little kind of depiction. The presence of the chemical weapons in the animal bodies and in our own, and maybe I can go back here, and in our own mixes past, present, and future, making multiple temporalities material in our own embodied time and flesh. The chemicals long left for the dead are instead very much alive, ghosting the bodies of the human and non-human animals whose DNA they may slowly be altering, or whose cells they may slowly be killing. As the amassed stuff of environmental violence gains new life and attracting new unintended victims, one may ask, what are our ethical obligations to our fellow species to right this wrong intragenerational scope? And maybe I can just end with a proposition from Christina Friedengren and Cecilia Osbury, who suggest thinking along the lines of intragenerational ethics in order to, quote, figure out how better to retie the material and immaterial knots between past, present, and future generations. It may open up a space for mourning, regrouping, and auto-worlding, for training us in an ethics of becoming better multi-species ancestors, end of quote. And with that, I would like to thank you. And I stop sharing.
There. Well, thank you very much, Marietta. That was really interesting. Very interesting. Now I want to come over and visit.
Fantastic. You're more than welcome. We are, you know, with open arms. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we have Ulysses next. You ready to go?
I am. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
So first and foremost, I wanted to say that I am working in the Musgo territory. Otherwise, they know themselves as Nomda, and this was historically a space of refuge for marooned, enslaved peoples that escaped from their plantations around Mexico. And so over time, it became a kind of Afro-Indigenous geography. I just wanted to acknowledge that, as well as say that the title of my presentation is Ecological Mourning, Locating the Specters of Climate Change. So we sat around in a circle telling stories, waiting for the rain to fall. Clouds were dark, heavy with promise. And the evening of the 24th of April, indigenous campesinos from this region in Mexico head to the hills or rivers to conduct rituals, petitioning Tlaloc, the god of rain, now known as San Marcos, for healthy rain to fall on their crops. The stories were enthralling, bonding us to the territory and to one another, opening a space of collective vulnerability where faith and its rewards are intimately linked to the environment. But times are changing. The climate is changing. The dark clouds were there, but the Tlaloc San Marcos hybrid deity did not visit us that day. The rain did not fall that evening or the next day. So we went home the next evening, saying goodbye to one another in a somber, sorrowful tone. Indigenous campesinos now speak of the constant disappointment they experience on this day when their elders, their customs, their faiths tell them to wait for the first rain of the season that no longer falls on that day. Can these experiences be contextualized as ecological grief? To answer this question, I turn to Jacques Derrida's concept of specters, as detailed in his 1994 book, Specters of Marx, the work of mourning the state of the dead and the new international. I will explain Derrida's blueprint for understanding specters, applied this to the absence of rain or the forced unpredictability of weather cycles and their impacts on local geographies, and provide example of how local storytellers work with specters. So in Specters of Marx, Derrida argues that specters can be thought of as assemblages of the past with their own sense of agency and desire, seeking restorative and transformative justice. He describes three key components that structure specters. These are mourning, language, and work. For specters to appear, there must be a corpse for mourning to occur, a sense of lingering injustice in the present. To make its claims be known, the specter then chooses a vessel that speaks its language, a familiarity with the concept from which the specter emerged. The vessel then must work, which is to say, carry out a task, an inheritance. This requires a politicized reframing of time as nonlinear, implying that the future, as it pertains to justice, is now. With this succinct understanding of specters as mourning, language, and work, we can turn to the absence of rain or the forced interruption of weather patterns alongside this model. So there is mourning. For mourning to occur, there must be a corpse, a specter. And here there are multiple specters. The specter of Tlaloc as a colonized and usurped deity, the absence of rain, etc. The vessel then chooses, the specter then chooses a vessel that speaks its language, a familiarity with the context from which the specter emerged. And in this context, the vessels can be the storytellers, those elders who may not understand the specificity of how human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases result in large-scale shifts in weather patterns, but their work, that inheritance as a task which they must carry and carry out, is to provide a language to help us understand localized impacts, to find new modes of language to communicate the local impacts of such an enormous force. Understanding the absence of rain or the localized impacts of climate change helps me to draw out implications. So the question that I asked myself is, can this experience be contextualized as ecological grief? So my initial impulse is to answer no. No, because grief is generally understood as internal personal, whereas in mourning is more external political. So to answer yes to this question requires the rejection of this bifurcation of experience, understanding the deep intimacies between grief and mourning, asserting the feminist principle that the personal is political, with specific attention to the geographies of the personal. Who's personal? And how this becomes political. In this sense, artists and storytellers turn grief into mourning. And I want to offer our exhibit as a localized example of the work of mourning. But I also want to leave you with a short version of the story we heard that day. I'll leave you with the story to stand on its own without any further intervention. It was late that evening when he arrived at the small pueblo in the mountain, which he felt was oddly deserted. But he knew that the people in the mountain were wary of strangers. The military continues to make sure of that. He was lost and hungry. All the doors and windows were shut. After walking around for a bit, he saw the glint of an eye through an old wooden door. Hello? I don't mean you any harm. I'm a campesino from the neighboring coastal towns. I got lost out here. I'm hungry. I have money. An old man opened the door and invited him in. He didn't have food, but he was willing to share coffee and his last pieces of bread with the stranger. Relieved, the stranger accepted the offer, and they sat in silence in the kitchen. Trying to break the silence, the stranger asked, "So, what do you do for a living?" "I'm a soul keeper," the old man replied. "What does that entail?" After a cinematic narrative of the long ritual, the old man explained that the earth was sick and that his job was to save a dying person's last breath in a small medicine flask, like those in his kitchen cabinets. A person's last breath, he believed, contained the life-animating aspect of their body, their soul. And so his job was to preserve those souls and release them long after the earth healed. Thank you.
That was quite an interesting story. Thank you, Ulysses. That really is, that's got so many layers to it. It's really, really quite something. And I love stories. I love storytelling. And, you know, for me, that's kind of a central feature, I think, of our common humanity is our sharing of stories. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you. Those were very profound and thought-provoking presentations. I said I wasn't going to share my screen, but I realized because many people probably haven't seen my film that it might be worthwhile to show the trailer. And so if I were to just copy the link to the trailer, could one of the hosts play that for me? I've copied, is that a possibility? Or, oh, I'm a co-host now. Maybe I can just do that. Let's see. Okay, yes, I can do it. Thank you. Sorry for the last minute. Here we go. So this is the trailer to my film, The Magnitude of All Things.
There's no sound.
Oh, you have no sound? I'm hearing.
When you share it, you have to share the sound as well. So
Oh,
if you
geez.
start over.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let's just go back. Sorry. Let me.
All the way back to the beginning of the sharing. Like,
Yeah, now I'm sorry about this. I don't,
okay.
let's see here.
This is Zoom life.
Yeah, Zoom life.
So if you X out of your browser and like quit sharing completely and then
Yeah,
start again.
Just a sec here. There's that. The problem is I'm using a different browser to share my screen. So, so if I go back to share screen, where do I have to share?
So whenever when you see at the very bottom left-hand corner, it'll say share sound. When you open up your share, there should be a share sound.
Ah, yes, there is. Thank you so much. Okay, my apologies. Okay. Please tell me right away if you don't hear the sound. Yep.
I don't think I can hear it.
You still can't hear it. Oh no. Do you want me to try to share it for you?
Is it still not working?
No, the sound isn't working.
Yeah, you know, I think that would be better. I'm sorry. I did choose I think it's because it's in a different browser. So I did post the link in the chat.
Do you want me to share it for you?
Yeah, thank you so much. I apologize.
Okay, and I'll make sure I share.
Sound is pretty important. Okay,
everyone
good.
See that?
Thank you.
You can see that all? Yeah.
Everyone can relate to grief of losing a loved one. But grief of losing your homeland, you don't realize how much you've lost until you stop and think about it.
es como destruir nuestro corazón.
It's like we're all implicated by admitting that the way we live is causing a catastrophe.
If this land hurts, we hurt.
La destrucción de la madre tierra es nuestra destrucción.
This culture is so unbelievably fucked.
It's time for revolution.
The thing with climate change, it's not like there's been one death and then we grieve it. This is continuous.
We need to tell the truth. We can't hide things just because it's not hopeful.
Out of the way! Will my grandchildren's eyes still be able to see what I see?
Estamos en un punto muy crítico.
Okay, thank you so much, and I apologize again for taking up time with the technical problems. So that is my film, The Magnitude of All Things, which is about ecological grief. As I said in my introduction, I sort of started to identify this feeling in myself about 10 years ago. And it happened exactly as I say at the beginning of the film, when I was in my garden on Salt Spring Island, and it was a beautiful July day. It was a flame-painted sky, one of the first skies we now relate to on the West Coast as an apocalyptic sky, really, because its rich color of orange and red is being caused by climate change-related fires nearby. And I looked up and I thought it was snowing, but it was actually ash. And it was just this crystal clear moment to this day when I realized that's not snow, that's ash, and it's ash from this climate change related fire. And I really, in that instance, for the first time in my life, knew what I was experiencing was grief for the changing world around us. And I was able to identify the feeling so precisely because a couple of years earlier, my sister had passed away from cancer. And so I really felt it. It was the same feeling, had the same tenor, but of different intensity. And I was working on another film at the time, also about climate change, but was that in that moment that I went, there's this huge part of the climate crisis that is mostly being overlooked in our public discourse, and that is the emotional and psychological dimensions of the climate crisis. And so that's when I started to make this film. And you know, really, because I have in my life as a activist, as a filmmaker, and in my academic life as well, always had a very deep and profound connection to the non-human and more than human worlds, really wanted to create a film that would allow viewers who had not either given themselves permission or whose culture had not given them permission to feel the grief in terms of the loss of the non-human world. I wanted to sort of create a doorway they could walk through. And so that's really my intention with this film. Fast forward then to 2019, and I'm traveling around the world with a small but really pro and dedicated team to climate front lines from Nunavut in northern Canada, speaking to the southernmost Inuit community who are experiencing temperature rises of about 4 degrees and witnessing the loss of their homeland. In the trailer, there's Sarah Balke, who is crying at the beginning of the trailer, speaking about that loss. So traveling there, traveling to Wanneroo traditional territory in what settlers call New South Wales in Australia, speaking to custodians there about open pit coal mining and how it is destroying their country. Also the Sapara in the Amazon rainforest, and where their territory is being encroached by mining and oil and gas, as well as, of course, monoculture farming. And I could go on, and just had this extraordinary experience of the former president of the Republic of Kiribati, Anote Tong, speaking about his island nation, which is forecasted to be underwater by 2100. But just extraordinary people on the front lines, many BIPOC communities, as we all know, who are being impacted the most and yet are the least responsible. And I spoke to them about what they were feeling, which is quite different than what they're often questions that are often posed to them. Usually it's more technical in nature or more about solutions. But really, I wanted to speak to these climate frontliners about how they were feeling. And of course, they expressed feelings of grief and sadness and despair, but they also expressed a lot of rage and anger at the injustice, because I think ultimately climate change is so unjust in terms of who it's impacting most. So I wanted to profile and give voice to these people who often do not have a voice. And there's a parallel story in my film as well, which is the story of the death of my sister, and just these overlapping themes of, coming to terms with our own mortality, coming to terms with the loss of a beloved human sister, and then coming to terms with the loss of the world around us. And there are obviously many similarities, but there's also some very strong differences in that, the scale and violence of the climate catastrophe is just so vast. It's very difficult, and really I have a great deal of compassion for those who want to turn away. And I really was trying, as I said earlier, to create a door that perhaps some viewers have been unwilling to walk through to date, just because of the deep grief. And how do you come to terms with something like this? I think that's a very important question, because I don't think you do. I think what instead one does, at least from my experience and observing those that I met, you let it transform you. And there's a key dynamic that I just want to discuss, and that is, how do we take these difficult feelings like ecological grief and use them to energize and not immobilize? And I think that for myself personally, as well as those who I met and who taught me so much, I learned there's two important things that seem to we'll go with the door metaphor that seemed to unlock that door, and one of them is, and Marietta spoke so eloquently about disenfranchised grief, and how our culture, neoliberal Western culture in particular, really has no place for this kind of grief of the non-human world. But first and foremost, there needs to be spaces for us to feel our grief, permission, so that we know we are not alone, and cultural ritual. We do profile a few of these in the film, including the youth grief group of Extinction Rebellion in London. But I think, having spaces, giving permission to feel is absolutely the first step in terms of letting grief energize, not immobilize. The second is taking action, which may sound like a bit of a truism, but for me, I like to frame it in a different sort of way. first of all, maybe I'll backtrack a little bit and just discuss the role of hope in taking action. And I try and present a more nuanced view of hope in my film, because as Greta says, and as others also say, you know, hope can, as my sister said, actually, hope can be a form of denial in and of itself. You know, there's a lot of reasons not to be hopeful right now for anyone that understands the consensus science around climate change. And so, you know, hope is not this Pollyanna idea that everything in the future is going to be okay. And in fact, that kind of hope can block us from taking action, because it can make us think that somebody else is, you know, it's okay, somebody else is going to solve the problem for us. Or it can mean that we don't take the risks or make the sacrifices that we need to make to take action. So for me, as is the case with Cornel West, as in the case of Joanna Macy, as in the case of many others, hope is a practice. It's a verb. And the fact that we act in the face of uncertainty is also means that hope is very courageous. So that is really the second key that I observed, and I myself as a filmmaker and activist have lived. That, you know, even though sometimes it's kind of against all odds, and I don't always succeed, and all of these other people who I'm referring to don't always succeed either in just even acting, and that sometimes we are immobilized, but sometimes we are energized. And as I say, those two keys are what I have observed to be the important ingredients to energize and not immobilize. So I think I'll just leave it at that. And I'm really honored to be in such extraordinary company, and thank the organizers of this really important symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am looking forward to actually being able to sit and watch your film, because there's so many really interesting things that resonate there. And one of the things that you were talking about too just sort of put me in mind of the idea of home, land as home, right? Land as home, and not the four walls and a roof that we have, but the land is home. You know, Mother Earth is our mother, right? And Jesse Thistle, when he did the 12 Dimensions of Indigenous Homelessness, where he wrote this report a few years ago, was published. But it really sort of, you know, as you were talking, it really sort of reminded me of that, because so many people that I've introduced this to have said, I've never thought of homelessness as something other than not having a roof over your head. But it's the cultural homelessness, it's the linguicide, you know, all of that. So anyway, we'll carry on. Tasha, you're up.
Thank you so much, everyone. I introduced myself already. So I'm going to start by saying that I'm actually here to speak for the water. And so the water that you see behind me is that of the Junction Creek. So I'm going to share my screen. I think I should be able to do this for myself this time. So can everyone see that? Yeah. Can I have a thumbs up or something? Yay! Thank you, Jennifer. So I introduced myself earlier, and I'm here on behalf of the water. We talk about the land and we talk about the earth and often, but you know, the water is also a part of that. So I've titled my presentation, Masks in the Water, the Grief of Nebe. In Anishinaabe, when we say Nebe, in Cree, Plains Cree, we say Nipi. We change the B for a P. And so I'm here as both a Nehiyaw Plains Cree woman and also as someone who was trained by Anishinaabe Kwewak on how to care for the water and what that means. And so, you know, for us, the water is living. She is alive. She is not a resource. She is a she. There's a definite feminine gender to her. And it connects to our narratives about how we as women are carriers of life, just like the water. And so we have those stories in the Midewin tradition. And for those that don't know, the Midewin is a medicine society. And we have our teachings written in something called sand scroll. So literally written in the sand. And they're only open to Midewin. And so they were driven underground with the colonization of our territories and our waters. And so, but our people held on to them. And above and all that, I'm a grandmother to two beautiful, beautiful little granddaughters. My eldest is now 6 years old, and my littlest one is going to be 2 in August. And that was the moment that everything shifted for me completely. I fully stepped into my understandings of what my responsibilities were as a grandmother and as a water walker. I had the honor and the privilege and the beauty of learning from the original water walker, a woman by the name of Josephine Ba Mandaman, Bidasage Ba, she who comes with the light. And she really did come with the light. I walked with her through all around the Great Lakes. And when you're walking the land, when you're understanding it from that, when you're walking Shkakamekwe and you're walking for the water, you're walking for those relations, and you begin to understand who you are in relation to those relations, right? We enter into a relationship with the land, and we enter into a relationship with the water. And so those walking in that way, and we followed the migration route of our ancestors. And so we were literally walking in the footsteps of our Anishinaabe relatives. And we stopped at the sacred places along the landscape. And you begin to understand creation from an entirely different perspective, one that is outside of what is taught in the dominant education system. You learn from the land and the waters themselves. And so I was fortunate to join her on 2 walks, 2015 and in 2017, we went from Duluth. In 2015, we went from Matan to Duluth, and then Duluth to Matan, 3,600 kilometers each way. And so again, it's a very different understanding. And one of the things you learn about is the legal kind of obligations. And by legal, I mean natural laws. I mean, in Cree, we have this term. One of them is described as Otsinewin. And that is, if you imagine rings around us, every time we step outside of that ring, we're breaking the laws of creation, right? So we're breaking a law. Every time we harm something other than human, right? And so Otsinewin is the garbage that we place on Shkakamekwe Gigawinawa ski. Otsinewin is the pollution that we put in the water. Otsinewin is the legacy that we're leaving for our children, right? Every single time we do that, it's actually breaking what we call Indigenous legal orders. And we're all culpable, all of us. That becomes the hard part. That becomes the very difficult part to carry. Otsinewin is the masks in the creek. Sorry, I don't know why it's going like all crazy here. It's going way ahead of me. Otsinewin is the masks in the creek. Oh, it did it again. Sorry, technical difficulties all around. But these were the masks that we found in Junction Creek. The Junction Creek is behind me. It's the little creek that I'm walking for within just 3 weeks from now, actually. And so one of the things that struck me, right, was that even with COVID, we still don't recognize that that energy that we're still placing. I picked up almost 20 masks from the creek. And that's just here in Sudbury, right? And the power of this little creek is that it actually dumps into the Great Lakes. So everything that goes into the creek behind me is going into the Great Lakes. So I want to share with you really briefly just a creative piece, and it's called I Awaken in Grief. So I awaken in grief, not for those passed on, but for those still here and the ones to come, the babies, the children, the grand, great grand, or collective children. I awaken in grief for the lands, the waters, for the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the swimmers, the crawlers, creation as we know it bleeding out as humanity stares into their screens, pockets their plastics, drops their garbage with looking up. Convenience is better than caring. Snap, Twitter, Gram, Book of Faces, TikTok, time is running out. Documentation of our own demise through our own devices. I awaken in grief for my people still wearing a cloak of trauma and hurt, a colonial legacy, a design of degradation, disenfranchisement, disempowerment, sharing small whispers, knives behind backs, bullies, closed doors and exclusions, propping up of violence and abuse. Colonially taught eyes look away but not at themselves and their complicity. I awaken in grief. For those still fighting the good fight who get worn down, whose backs buckle under the weight of the colonialistic, capitalistic, cannibalistic regime, the privilege blinding as the doctrine of discovery moves its way through Indigenous knowledges, stories, through our Indigenous spirits. My eyes stay open, using the bundles of our ancestors. Nothing can touch us once we learn how to harness, hold heart. Our ancestral power is ours and only ours, a legacy to help us turn around the grief they knew would be coming. Our ancestral power is written in the land and carried by the water. If we discontinue our negligence,
one of the things Josephine Bauman
change things around.
One of the things
that's what Josephine Baugh used to say to us all the time. If we discontinue our negligence, we can change things around. And it really will take all of us. I have to have hope. My grandbabies are the ones who are going to carry everything forward. I have to have hope. I have to know that we as Indigenous people have something to offer that is so deeply profound, right? And people see our they see the movement, for example, of the water walk and think how quaint, but it's a powerful ceremony, right? And if we can get others to understand that and support it, we get no funding, right? We walk across the earth. Josephine Baugh, she never received any kind of funding for any of the walks that she did, any of the work that she did. You know, because it's not for that we do the work that we do. It really is about those future, those children and those grandchildren. And it's for the water herself. It's for us to understand who she is and the implications of that. right? The implications of our current relationship. And so with that, you know, I didn't ask to be a water walker. I didn't want to be a water walker. I'd rather be inside of, you know, I'd rather be sitting and spending time with my grandchildren, but I can't do that. I have to activate. I'm not an activist. I have to activate. And for me, that is walking across the land in ceremony. That's visiting the people, visiting the sites, even in COVID. And so the first walk we're going to do is for Junction Creek, the one you see behind me, who desperately needs it. We'll do a 4-day walk. It's 135 kilometers. It's about 30 kilometers a day. And then a week after, I will begin in the mountains in Alberta, and I will walk to Lake Winnipeg, a total of 1,900 kilometers every day. And people say, you know, I don't want to do that, but I'm driven to. I have to. And the way that I understand it is because the water is asking me to. And so I'll continue to move for the water. I'll continue to move for my grandchildren. I'll continue to move for your grandchildren and for all of life. Because what we have and what we know is beyond anything that anyone can even imagine. And I have faith in my ways of knowing and being in the world that we're going to survive no matter what. We've already survived 500 years of this colonial occupation of our lands and territory. We're going to survive. Of that, I have no doubt. The world will look different. And so I have to have faith and I have to have hope. And so with that, I'll say miigwech, Kananaskumten, for listening. Nahau.
Which sounds like a lot of work coming up there, Tasha. A lot of prayers. Anyway, so we're kind of at about just a bit after 6, and I just kind of wanted to get a sense from people. Like I gather some people are able to stick around a little bit. Is that the plan here, Mickey, or what are we doing? Because we can say have a wonderful weekend and see you later, bye-bye, or we can say we got time for a little conversation. So I'm looking for some direction.
Well, if anyone has, I think people are very moved by the powerful, very, very powerful presentations and the sentiment, a lot of emotion. If anyone would like to put something in the chat, we can just see, but I think perhaps we've had a long day, or is it just me?
And I think there's some value, you know, as often as it is, or as much as it is a really rare thing to get together with people who you know all share very similar sort of passions and be able to share those ideas, especially when we're in clearly such disparate locations and all of that. At the same time, sometimes it's really important to have time and space to just, you know, process what you've been taking away. I know that like I mentioned before, there's a lot of layers to things that have been shared here tonight through each of the presentations. And I know personally, as I was trying to, you know, sort of like think about what, you know, if we had time, some of the things that, you know, I would want to think about is like things like, how do we respond to this? Because this is big stuff. This isn't little stuff, but we're each an individual and we can only do what we can do personally. So Yeah, anyway.
I think one of the things that I take from this is a sense of hopefulness. And I think, you know, feeling a great deal of inspiration, a lot of action oriented presentations as well, which really, you know, tell us that, you know, there are things that we can do. And I think perhaps we'll just close this session down now. If do any of the presenters have something that they're burning to say before we say goodbye?
I just put some links in. If you are interested in following our journey for the Sask River, will take us approximately 2.5 months, walking approximately 30 kilometers every day, getting up at 3:30, 4 a.m., walking all day till 5. And we're actually, part of what we're trying to raise consciousness about is they're trying to shave off the Rocky Mountains, the top of the Rocky Mountains, for something called mountaintop removal for coal mining. So we're also raising consciousness about the impact if they do get the go ahead to do that, the impact will be tremendous. Yeah, because that's a major aquifer that sits. And of course, as someone had mentioned in that previous presentation, all of those waters are connected, right? And so I follow Josephine Ba. You know, she was a grandmother when she started off, and she was all by herself. And by the end of her, she gave her life for the water. And by the end of it, you know, the whole phrase "water is life," she really drew attention on a major scale. And so, you know, every person that sees us when we walk, they ask, right? And so it becomes an opportunity. We do become walking prayers, but we also become walking across our own territories draws the attention of many. So if anyone wants to support us, we are totally open for that. There's only 6 of us. All of us are women. And so 3 of us are over the age of 50, myself included. So yeah, it'll be quite the endeavor. So all the support, it would be really deeply appreciated. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Well, I really would like to close this then with a thanks to everyone. Your generous participation has really been provocative, and thank you for all what you've offered and all the hard work that went into this. And I encourage everybody to check out the exhibits. And tomorrow we have a panel discussion. And our closing, we've left it as about 2 hours. We have a lot of artists involved, so you can tune in and tune out depending on your how long you want to Zoom for. But anyway, we're still one more event, and of course it takes time to go through the exhibit. So I hope you get a chance to do that. The website will be taken, it will be not interactive, but it will be archived and still be available for 1 year. So people can still access the information if you do want to share it, and everything has been recorded. So thank you very much.